morning.
Hello, hello. Hi. Nice to
Hi,
be
good
with
Hello.
you. Morning.
morning, Archbishop.
Nice to be with you.
Are you in York?
I am, yes, at Bishopthorpe, which is just outside of York. It's the
Right.
very swanky official residence for the Archbishop.
Is it? Oh, well, love to visit it one day then.
Well, it is astonishingly beautiful.
Yes, I just wanted to thank you first of all for agreeing to meet with us and to do this interview. It's very generous of you, and particularly to give us an hour of your time as well, because I know how busy you must be. I'd like to introduce myself, Iftikhar Owan, the President of Muslims for Britain. And then we also have with us, of course, Raghi Umar, who needs no introduction, one of our finest journalists in the UK. And then we have one of our colleagues, Absul, who's doing the technology side of things. Can I just first of all ask how best to address you? Because I know officially you're the most reverend, the right honourable.
Yeah, just Steve. I'm happy with Stephen.
Are you sure? Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, that's very, very kind of you. So I shall address you as Stephen, if that's okay.
Yeah, that's fine.
Yeah. Okay. So hopefully this is just really going to be a conversation. We just wanted to get to know you a little bit better to find out about your work as the Archbishop and actually some of the concerns that you have in that, and some things that mutually we're all concerned with in terms of environment and the pandemic, etc. So I'm going to sort of pass over to Raghi, who will be conducting most of the interview, well, conversation really, and I'll probably drop in and maybe ask one or two questions as well, if that's okay.
Of course.
Okay, over to you, Raghi.
Thank you very much indeed, Iftikhar. Thank you, Stephen. It's a great pleasure to have you. And I'll just sort of dive straight in. For a lot of people who are of different faiths and maybe of no faiths, they'll be asking themselves, well, why do we have an Archbishop of York as well as an Archbishop of Canterbury? And what's the historic reasons for that? And what are the different roles the two positions play in British life?
Yeah, what a good question, and I'm sure I should know the answer. No, I think I probably do, which is the first Archbishop of York was in the year 627, and it was somebody called Paulinus, who was a companion of Saint Augustine, who was sent by Gregory. Some people will know from their English history the story. But of course, that wasn't the first Christian presence in this country. That was Augustine 597. The See of York was established in 627. But Christianity in these islands predated that. Constantine was proclaimed emperor in York. And there's evidence of Christianity in these islands. And I say in these islands because often it was at the what we would think of as the extremes in Ireland, Wales, Cornwall, and indeed the northeast. The northeast of England was a great centre for Christianity. And so, in other words, the structures that we've inherited in the church predate, modern nation states. What we think of as the British Isles was a whole network of kingdoms. And the church's governance kind of reflected that as the church became more. And so the primary unit of organisation for the church is a diocese. And so first of all, the Church of England is a network of 42 dioceses. And then from very, very early on, I'm afraid I haven't got the date at my fingertips, but from very, very early on, it was split into two provinces, a province in the north, a province in the south, with two archbishops. And that provincial structure is also across the worldwide Anglican Communion, something very similar in the Catholic Church. Now, if you wanted to be cynical about this, which I don't necessarily want to be cynical about it, you could say it was classic Roman politics, divide and rule. make sure that nobody's actually in charge. And so having two provinces in England was politically expedient for Rome. And so I also have the title Primate of England, and Canterbury has the title Primate of all England. And up until the Reformation, there was, sorry, you'll wish you hadn't asked the question.
No, it's very interesting.
I promise I'll stop in a minute. Up until the Reformation, there was often quite a bit of tension between the two provinces who had supremacy, which was that was resolved centuries ago. And so the Canterbury is the sort of, as it were, the first amongst equals. We don't have the Archbishop of Canterbury is not like the Church of England's equivalent of the Pope. He's not in charge in that sense. And York is seen as being the number two. But actually, our aim is to work very, very closely together. But that's the historic reason.
But that's very interesting, because actually, although obviously I'm Muslim and grew up in a Muslim family, I studied at university. One of the courses I took, I had to take actually, but I found it very interesting, was the establishment of Christianity in Britain. And one forgets in this day and age that actually it was a long process. We take it for granted that the United Kingdom is sort of was ready formed as a sort of Christian sort of nation, but actually it was a very, very long process to establish it, all the way from Lindisfarne, Ireland, as you sort of put it. It was a long process.
It was, and it ebbed and flowed. I mean, I was until recently the Bishop of Chelmsford. And the story of how Christianity came to the land of the East Saxons, now Essex, is a really interesting one, because the church was established and then sort of disappeared with sort of, Viking raiders and other problems coming in from other parts of the world. Christianity disappeared. And then Saint Ced, who was a missionary from Holy Island up here in the north, sailed down the east coast, and the first church that he built, he used discarded stones from ruined Roman buildings, and so there's evidence of Christianity in Colchester from the 3rd century, very, very early evidence, and then it kind of disappears for a couple of hundred years.
It's also, a long sort of process at the same time. I mean, quite recently, there's a lot of evidence from Wales, from England, of trade with Muslim nations. I mean, you found sort of coins from the Umayyad period, and going back really to the early parts of this country. So we were quite a sort of it's a quite derided sort of term these days, but multicultural and multi-faith country for quite a long period of time.
We were. I mean, there's evidence of that here in York, which obviously was a big Roman settlement, as there is in Colchester and in other places. And I think the other thing, which I learned this actually when I went to Northern Ireland for the first time, that actually the trade routes by sea were often more secure than the trade routes by land. And so there's very, very close relationships between, say, Belfast and Glasgow, and have been for centuries and centuries and centuries. And that's actually because the sea passage was much safer to go by sea. Actually, there were, you could see the pirates and the bandits coming in the way that you couldn't when you travelled by road. So those ancient seafaring, and of course this nation has always been a seafaring nation, and therefore has had these links around the world, which we think are relatively new. But actually are deeply ingrained in our history.
So you were brought up, Stephen, going back to your early sort of life in Leigh-on-Sea. So what was the early influences on you that led to you becoming a part of the sort of church?
I wasn't brought up in a church-going family, so in that sense, I was kind of typical of so many people of my generation, or the post-war generations. So my parents were probably the last generation where going to church was relatively normal, and so they were part of church-going families. And then in the post-war years, I was born in 1958, so that the 50s and 60s, I don't think they ever rejected the Christian faith, but massive changes in society, with, I think, the impact in terms of how we thought about ourselves in relation to each other and to God, that have been impacted by the Somme, Auschwitz, Hiroshima, all those huge events of the 20th century. They just stopped going to church. I mean, I don't think they consciously rejected it, but they just stopped going. So I was baptized as a child, so I did have one visit to church in my childhood. And then my story is quite a long one, so I won't bore you with all the details. But for me, the important thing is, first of all, a belief in God. Which I've found so interesting, that children do seem to have a belief in God, and children do seem to have quite a sophisticated belief in God, because children also believe in Father Christmas and the Tooth Fairy and all the rest of it. And yet children also believe in God. And if you talk with children, which I like doing and have tried to do a lot of, they are able to distinguish these things are not the same. And it seems like it's almost hot wired. Now, I know as Christians and as Muslims, that doesn't come as a surprise to us, because we share that belief in the supremacy and the sovereignty of God, and that God is the creator and source of all. Therefore, it's not a surprise to us that human beings have a sense of God, as it were, hot wired into them. So that was definitely my experience. Even though I wasn't formed in the Christian faith, I believed in God. And then various events in my sort of early teens brought me into, as it were, the orbit of the church. And therefore, that faith, which I think was inside of me, which I didn't really know what to do with, but was there, started being shaped. And because I'm a fairly all or nothing kind of person, I find it quite hard to distinguish between starting to go to church, becoming a Christian, and sensing a vocation to ordained ministry. I'm not suggesting being ordained is the only way you can serve God as a Christian, but for me, it was a kind of all at once kind of thing. I don't mean in any kind of flashing lights way, but once I'd taken one step, I saw that somehow the one step contained within it all the other steps as well. Though I didn't tell anybody.
But you studied media studies, so you could have
I did.
Ended up on my side of the fence.
That was it was very interesting. It was a great honor, a great joy. I don't know whether you ever listened to Inheritance Tracks on Radio 4 on a Saturday morning.
You were there last Sunday, weren't you?
I was interviewed for it, which was a joy, though I had so many sleepless nights trying to choose two pieces of music. But it was very interesting, because Richard Coles introduced me by saying, because I studied at Central London Polytechnic, he described it as the Sandhurst for Channel 4, which I'd never heard that used before.
I hadn't either.
But it's funny because Michael Jackson, who went on to be, was a we were students together. We were friends. We've lost touch over the years, but we were students together. And it's funny because at the time there were only two places in the country where you could study that sort of thing. It's now become a very popular thing, but there was Sheffield, and then there was Central London Polytechnic. And I nearly went to art school, because the only things I was ever any good at was sort of writing and the arts. And I nearly went to art school, but wasn't really good enough. And then because of my interest in film, television, the media, that's what I ended up doing. And that's what I thought I would, I still had inside me this idea that one day I'd be a priest. But I thought I'll do that when I'm old, when I'm 30 or something.
Did that side of things inform your faith and how you went about being, a priest? Excuse me, a priest.
Bless you.
Thank you.
I've always been very concerned with how we communicate the Christian faith. And I've always had a particular interest in how we communicate the Christian faith through the arts and through the media. So that was clearly shaped by my interest in that world from way back. Though it's funny speaking about it now, because it feels like another lifetime ago. So although that is what I did, it is true. It's almost like I need to pinch myself and say, yeah, that is true. You're not making it up. Yes, that did happen. It's such a long time ago. And in the end, I worked in the film industry for a year or two in a kind of freelancey kind of way, doing very menial things. But the call to ordination was too strong, and eventually I just had to do something about it. And that was my one, not quite a conversion experience, but you may remember this, Raggy. I don't know what it was like for you in your early career, but certainly when I was in my early 20s, it was kind of in the film industry. It was very freelance. You sort of went from one to the next. And I can remember going for an interview for a job on I can't even remember what it was now. And I'm arriving at the interview, let's say 10 o'clock. I'm standing outside the door, about to knock on the door to go to the interview. And as I'm about to knock on the door, I thought, this is not what I'm supposed to do with my life.
That's very interesting.
And I just turned around. I never knocked on the door. I just turned around and went to see.
It was a very specific moment then.
Yeah, that was the moment when I thought, I've got to do something about it. And I went to see my parish priest and just said, I think God might be calling me to be a priest. I've just got to do something about it.
And how did that's very interesting. These sort of moments, decisive sort of moments,
Life-changing.
the way they affect our lives. But what happened next then, Stephen?
Well, it all then happened very, very quickly. I mean, especially as I look, it didn't feel quickly at the time, because when you're that age, everything seems to take an age. But now that I know how long the process can take for some people, it happened very quickly. So that would have been I guess that must have happened in late summer, early September, 1 year. And I started training for ordination exactly a year later. So in the space of a year, it all happened. And even by yesterday's standards, that's fairly quick. The Church of England has, I think rightly, quite a long, well, not long, but it has a discernment process that we go through. And it's very unusual for it all to happen in the space of a year. But there we are.
That's interesting. Iftikhar, do you want to ask this question about sort of, about pilgrimage and its importance and Stephen's sort of involvement in that? I think that would be quite good coming from you.
Yeah, sure. So Stephen, pilgrimage, we know has quite a long history in Christianity, and you've done a number of pilgrimage. But you walk from Camino to Santiago de Compostela in Spain a couple of times. And of course, pilgrimage is quite important in the Islamic faith as well. And one of the 5 pillars, of course, is the pilgrimage to Mecca. Once a lifetime, if you can afford it and are physically and mentally able to do so. But of course, we're also encouraged to do the pilgrimage to Medina and to Jerusalem itself. What do you see as a kind of purpose of pilgrimage, and what's the particular significance of the Santiago de Compostela pilgrimage?
Yeah, I and here I have to. I do know how central pilgrimage is to Islam. And it's not central to the Christian faith in the same way, and so I think if we were to draw a Venn diagram of how Christians and Muslims see pilgrimage, I think there'd be quite a bit of overlap, but there'd also be some separation. But here, you must forgive my ignorance if I'm misunderstanding how you see pilgrimage. I think in the Christian tradition, or perhaps I should say how I see it, which I believe is an Orthodox Christian way of looking at it. It's more about traveling than arriving. It's about what, and I say Muslims may see it exactly the same way. I simply don't know. So it would be, it is what happens to you on the journey rather than what happens to you at the destination, which is the benefit of pilgrimage. Which is why I get slightly frustrated with the modern day expression of pilgrimage in Christianity, because it's hugely popular, the idea of pilgrimage. But in many Christian churches, to go on pilgrimage means hiring a bus. You'll get on the bus, you go to the holy place, wherever it is, Canterbury or Holy Island. You get off the bus. There would be a service in the church. then you'd hit the gift shops and have a picnic, and then you'd get back on the bus. And I think, well, most Christians throughout history would not really have recognized that as a pilgrimage, because they would have thought it is making the journey and dedicating the journey to God and what you learn on the journey.
Yeah, what you learn about yourself and others. But I
Yeah,
guess it's
which is fundamental to the
John
purpose.
Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress, I guess, is that story being
Yeah.
related, isn't it?
Yeah. Well, I think it's about, by making the journey, you have a deeper understanding of your life as a journey. So I would say one of the ways to understand life, well, what's the difference between somebody, and here I think I will use the phrase of faith, because I think this is something that Christians would share with people of other faiths. So what's the difference that faith makes? Well, we all know life's a journey. You don't need to be a person of faith to know that it begins when you're born, it ends when you die. It's like a journey. And as you get older, you become more aware that there's, more road behind you than up ahead of you. There's nothing Christian or religious about that. But faith makes a difference, because the journey which ends in death becomes the pilgrimage, the holy pilgrimage, which leads to God and to, as a Christian, to the life we believe we have with Christ through death and beyond death. And so by making that journey and reflecting upon life as pilgrimage, that would be, as it were, the spiritual benefit. And of course, this is something we would share very much in common with Muslims. There are sacred places associated with our faith where, yes, it is still what happens on the journey, which is fundamental to pilgrimage, but then there is also the experience of renewal of faith at the holy place that we travel to. And we believe that it's not that God is more present in, say, Jerusalem or Rome or Canterbury than other places, but that those places which have been hallowed by the prayers of other pilgrims, of Christian people, and particularly associated with the life of Christ, are what we might call thin places where heaven and earth seem a little closer together than they normally do. So there's also benefit to be found in the place itself.
Yeah. Makes sense.
But I know when I first walked to Santiago, which is, it is one of the great pilgrimages of the Christian faith, probably the most, apart from Jerusalem and possibly Rome, the most famous place of pilgrimage is Santiago. When I got there, my overwhelming desire was to keep walking.
Interesting.
Yeah, that was my, overwhelming desire to keep walking. And of course, in a way, that was also an important lesson, because a lesson for life as well, that actually it will come to an end.
Yeah. Very true. Stephen, one of the things, it's a big question, and it weighs on everyone who is, has a faith in Britain today, because there are a huge number of people that don't have, a faith in Britain. So what role, as we see sort of, declining, attendance, regular attendance, I should probably say, in church, what role do you think that faith plays in the public space? Because I was very aware during, the preparations for the service for the funeral of Prince Philip, the Archbishop of Canterbury was very aware that this was, a man, admired and, who touched the lives of many people, but yet this was a service that had to have relevance for people that didn't believe in any God. So I was quite taken by that. I mean, what do you think the role of faith is in public life?
Yeah, well, I think what faith can do in public life is, well, I would say, first of all, put ourselves in perspective. To place ourselves in the perspective of not just history, obviously, though faith is good at helping human beings to take a long view. But of course, from the perspective of God and God's, what we would call as Christian, God's kingdom. So the prayer that Christians say every day, the Lord's Prayer, begins Our Father in heaven, hallowed be your name. Your kingdom come. Your will be done on earth as in heaven. Now that is quite a political statement to make, to say that God's will be done on earth as in heaven. God's will be done on earth as in heaven. So that is a kind of shaping prayer and shaping principle for Christians' activity in the world. And so constantly, at our best, the Christian contribution to that is to say, we are trying to look at our lives, the way we inhabit the earth, the things of the world, from the perspective of God's will and God's kingdom.
Yeah.
God's kingdom will be God's reign, God's sovereignty. So now, sometimes, of course, that leads us into trouble. It's deeply uncomfortable. People don't want to hear that. But actually, often, I think what the world is crying out for, they may not be consciously crying out for God, but they are crying out for an agenda and a set of values which are outside of ourselves, beyond any one political party or political narrative. I mean, the example I often use is of, why do parents want to send their children to church schools? Now, not all of them do, of course, but the evidence is that a vast majority of parents of all faiths and no faiths want their children to go to church school if there's one available. Why? Well, it's not because they have a conscious belief. I mean, obviously, first of all, it says, well, they're probably not atheists, though some atheists still want their children to go to church schools. But it does mean what they want is ethos, values, which I understand to be those things which are outside ourselves, those things which are not simply a matter of opinion. I've got my truth, you've got yours. But there's that kind of inchoate sense that, there is a set of values, a way to live, and I want that for my children. I lived and served as a priest in Huddersfield for 9 years, and the parish that I lived in, 70-80% of the parishioners were Muslims. About another there was a Sikh Gurdwara temple in the parish. There was also a lot of Sikhs. That was the community I lived in, and made good friends with my Muslim and Sikh neighbours. There was a church school, Church of England primary school, and that was the school everybody wanted their children to go to. And I can remember having fascinating conversations with my Muslim neighbours about this. And of course, they were very welcome, because as you probably know, the vast majority of Church of England schools are not faith schools, meaning you have to sign up to the faith to go there. They're community schools run on Christian values. And I remember talking to my Muslim neighbours and saying, and I think, to paraphrase the conversations, they would say, we'd love there to be a Muslim school available, but there isn't. Yeah. But we choose this school because this is the place where God is honoured. This is where we recognise that our faith will be honoured, where we recognise the values that underpin the life of the school. And frankly, we'd rather they went there than to the so-called state school, which the secular materialists tell us is the sort of the neutral place, much better place. Yeah. But actually, it was the people of other faith traditions who recognized, no, given a choice, we'd rather have the specificity of a church school because God is honored. And that for us is kind of almost, that is so precious, and we believe that our faith will be honoured by people of another faith rather than people of no faith at all, who make the mistake of thinking all faiths are the same and it doesn't really matter. It really does matter, and therefore, anyway. So I think it's for those reasons that not just the church, but all the faiths have a part to play. I also think it's where we can work. It's one of the best areas where we can work together. I think where we have a united voice on these kinds of issues, we demonstrate something very, very, very powerful.
Very interesting. Iftikhar, did you want to jump in?
No, I was just going to say that you talk about that, and we made a very similar choice for my niece and nephew when they were younger. There was a local state school, but there was also a local Catholic school as well, and my brother, my sister-in-law wanted the children to attend the Catholic school because, again, as you say, the ethos and at least there was a belief in God in that school compared to the other schools. So they did that for that very specific reason.
Yeah.
One thing I wanted to sort of ask Stephen is that and just explain is that actually one of the sort of, as I understand it, in the Church of England, it's incredibly at the really local parish level. It's quite a sort of inclusive and democratic system. You don't have to be a sort of a Christian to belong to a parish. Is that right?
Oh well, yes. I mean, it'd be unusual for people for that to be the case, but the Church of England has had this, I think, beautiful idea. Though you may think he would say that, but I think it's a beautiful idea that we're the church for everybody, and therefore we're the church for people who don't go to church. So if you go to speak to an Anglican parish priest, Church of England parish priest, and if you were to say, how many people in your parish, they would tell you, quick as a flash, the population of the parish.
Yeah.
So when I served in that parish in Huddersfield, I said, if people said to me, how many people in your parish? I'd have said, there are, I think it was about 18,000 people, about 18,000 people, I'd say.
Yeah.
Now, the fact is that about 14 or 15,000 of them were Muslims, but they were still my parishioners.
Yeah.
And I felt I had a duty towards them. Now, don't misunderstand me. I absolutely respected and honoured their faith and wanted them to flourish in their faith. But I didn't believe that I was simply a chaplain to the Christians.
Yeah.
We are the established church of this land, here to serve everybody, and therefore everybody is welcome in our church buildings. We don't apply any test of faith to those who walk through the door. And as you'll probably know, I've always had I've always thought if I wasn't a Christian, I'd probably be a Sikh. Actually, I've always found Sikhism there's something very, for me, very beautiful and inclusive about Sikhism. And because this parish did have quite a lot of Sikhs, some of them did often come to the church. because that, when I say often, it wasn't unusual to have. And the thing with Sikhs is it's usually quite easy to spot them by their dress.
Sure.
So I knew that it was, because Christianity is very, very strong, obviously, as you know, in Asia. But I thought, these are Sikhs. And sometimes I check out afterwards, and they came because I don't really know why they came. They just came because they came. So from time to time you would see them in the church. So and they would be welcome.
Yeah. As the Archbishop of York, Stephen, you're very aware, and you're very much at the hierarchy of the church. Do you think that the Church of England's centrality to the United Kingdom as its the state is something good, or is it in some ways a hindrance? And the church occupies a space at the heart of the political system. May not be formally making laws and whatnot, but what I want to ask is, today, do you think that's an anomaly, or do you think that that's something that could help in a multi-faith country?
Yeah, I could argue it both ways. It is unusual. There are very, very few other examples of it around the world where the church is established and the church has by right, and is therefore a pillar of the kind of famous unwritten constitution of the United Kingdom, that this is the established church of this land, and there are bishops. I sit in the House of Lords. There we are. It always makes me smile when journalists say, that church and politics shouldn't mix, and I think, well, hang on a minute, I'm a member. I'm a member of Parliament, I sit in the House of Lords. That has been the British system for a very, very long time, and there there are clearly problems and challenges with that. I think some people say that it can blunt the prophetic edge of the church. We are not so much close to power, we're right there in the corridors and seats of power. Therefore, how can we speak prophetically to power? And I understand that argument. But my experience is that the bishops in the House of Lords is a relatively small number, 26 of us. Our role within the House of Lords is different from the other Lords. There's the Lords Temporal, everybody else, and then 26 Lords Spiritual with a specific role. And I believe it gives us an opportunity to speak about the things of God, to speak about faith, to speak up on behalf of all faiths, not just, we're not there representing the Church of England. We are there as part of the constitution of our nation. So we're there speaking for all faiths, not just our own. And I believe we can be a power for good within that. But I could argue it both ways. Sure. But I think if we were starting from scratch, would we come up with a system like this? Well, almost certainly no. No. But I think it feels to me, and again, I realise that, would I say this if I wasn't the Archbishop of York? I just don't know. But it feels to me that the presence of the church as the established church is woven into the history of this land. And I'm always cautious about cutting those things off. Yeah. Because when you cut a woven piece of material, yeah, you think you're cutting a straight line, but actually as soon as you've made the cut, everything starts to fray. And that's my worry with these things, especially with unwritten constitutions.
That's a very good way of putting it.
So I know that actually I don't have great power or influence, in government. But I do have a voice and a place which is there by right, and therefore I'm able to do things and say things which I believe contribute to the common good.
That's very interesting.
Can I just ask on that?
Yeah, you want to ask about multi-faith issues?
Yeah, and I think that just as you were saying earlier on about the fact that people of faith who aren't Christian would probably choose a Christian school to send their children to in preference to a secular school. I think if we were asked the question, would you prefer not to have bishops sitting in the House of Lords and no representation, or actually have bishops? And I would personally say I'd like to have some spiritual presence in the House of Lords. So if it's Christian, that's fine. And as you say, you're not just speaking on behalf of Christian, but actually you're speaking on behalf of people of faith. In relation to that sort of specific having a voice in Parliament, though, has there been any kind of legislation which Lord Spiritual, if you like, have had some influence on, which you're particularly proud of making faith's voice heard, and therefore that legislation sort of coming about?
Well, yes. There's probably lots and lots of examples where, of course, it's always with others because we're a small voice. So it's always a matter of lending our voice in coalitions of goodwill, usually across party boundaries. But the thing that immediately springs to mind where I was personally involved, not that I take any great personal credit for this, but it was a good example of, I think, how the church can raise the moral temperature of government, was over child refugees. So you may remember a few years ago, Lord Dubbs, who himself was put on a train in Berlin by his family as a small boy in 1939, 1940, as part of the Kindertransport. Came to this country, now is a member of a Labour member of the House of Lords, a great man. And there was widespread across the political spectrum view a few years ago that the number of unaccompanied child refugees that this country was taking was inadequate and going against the grain of our history. So Lord Dubbs proposed an amendment to the bill that was passing through the House of Lords to address that. And the first thing he did was turn to the Lord Spiritual for support, because I think he knew politically and tactically if the bishops are getting behind something, even though we'll be accused by some in some parts of the press of meddling in politics, actually, on the whole, we don't do that often. But if we do lend our voice, it actually takes a little bit out of party politics. To say there's some ethical issues that we have a system to make sure that there has to be a bishop on duty in the House of Lords every day, because we lead the prayers every day. And I happen to be the duty bishop, and we have a duty bishop system to make sure one of us is always there. I was the duty bishop that week, so it came to me, and I was honoured and delighted to second the amendment and speak in favour of it, and it got passed, and eventually the government accepted it, even though I'm afraid and ashamed to say they never acted upon it, but they did accept it, or didn't act upon it fully. But there's been, I guess there's been hundreds of examples of that where the church has contributed to decisions, but we're very rarely the initiator of the decisions.
Can I come back to kind of multi-faith society and multi-faith Britain that Raggy was talking about? What role have you sort of personally played then in talking to and coming together with other faiths, and in particular with such a focus on Islam and Muslims, the other Muslim community? What interactions have you had with Muslims and Muslim leadership in this country, and what have you kind of learned from those interactions?
I mean, quite a lot. Though I wouldn't claim any great leadership or any great experience in these areas. I mean, first of all, there was my experience, which I've alluded to in Huddersfield, where I was living in a community where most of my neighbours were Muslims, where my children's friends, they were at a school where most of the children were Muslims, so their friends were Muslims. And I think that's probably shaped my understanding more than I realise. In fact, answering your questions actually made me realise how it shaped it, because I think for me, friendship is the important thing, which may sound I fear that sounds like setting the bar rather low, but I don't think so. My experience is that that if you asked a lot of a lot of white people, I mean, have you got friends who are Muslims? I fear the answer might be no. So friendship seems to me to be really, really important. And I suppose even as I speak now, I realize, I think I learned that just by living in that community, and these were my neighbours. So you just got to know people. When I became Bishop of Reading, which was my first job as a bishop, we introduced a kind of whole policy of friendship, and all the interfaith work that was done in Reading was based around building friendship. So doing things together, eating together. We had a picnic once a year where the different faiths would all get together. And we weren't trying to have theological debate. We weren't trying to agree or disagree with one another, but we were committed to getting to know each other. And that felt really good and important work to do. And I think that also carried on when I became, before York, I was the Bishop of Chelmsford, which includes the East End of London, the London Borough of Newham, which I think is officially the most diverse place in Western Europe. So these were big issues of diversity, interfaith, multi-faith were huge issues for us. And I think we carried on a similar policy of, there's so much we could do together, so much we should do together, but we don't actually know each other very well. So let's try to build ways of getting to know each other. My favourite story of this, which I must briefly tell you, is there's a wonderful priest in East London called Chigo Chike, who's Nigerian. He's an academic, and he's written lots of books about these issues. He's written a wonderful little book about Christians befriending and getting to know Muslims. and he was one of the coordinators of interfaith stuff in East London, in Newark. And the first event he invited me to was a sort of pre-Christmas get-together for faith leaders. And I had no idea really what I was coming to, but I arrived at this meeting, and Chigor welcomed us all and introduced the evening. We knew there was going to be a meal, and he said, well, we're going to eat the meal first. And he said, and there was about 20 of us there. He said, I want each of us to speak for, just a little while, so that we can get to know each other. Could you all please tell us your favorite joke? And so after dinner, one by one, we all, which is a nerve-wracking thing to do, we all stood up and told a joke to everybody else. Now, I'm sure if I'd said to people, I'm going to an interfaith meeting this evening, leaders of all the different faith traditions in East London, people would have thought I was going to a very serious, highbrow, maybe quite tense meeting. We ate and we laughed together. And I have to say, the Imam told the most racy joke, I have to tell you.
You're not going to repeat it.
And it was, but it was great. So, yeah, in some ways I want to apologize for not having greater wisdom than that. But actually, I think building community together, building friendship, without that.
I think I completely relate to that. I mean, I'm the founder of the Ultimate Interfaith Group, which has now been going for 20 years. Actually, I helped set that up in 2001 after 9/11. In fact, to bring the different faith communities in Altrincham to South Manchester together, and actually, what the thing that we've concentrated on most is what we call friendship circles. And each circle has a couple of Muslims, a couple of Jews, a couple of Christians, Hindus. We have very few Sikhs in the area. Who regularly meet in each other's homes and get to know each other as an individual, because we believe that that's really the best way of people really getting to know each other and becoming friends. And my particular friendship circle has now been going for 16 years, and I think that's quite right. So it's at that deeper level then that you really understand and actually talk about things which are common, and realizing that we are, as human beings, have pretty much the same concerns and things. And as people of faith, of course, our faith drives us so much.
Sorry, Iftikhar.
Yeah, sorry. No, please comment. Yeah.
No, I mean, it's so easy for us to other each other, and talk about each other. I mean, simple phrases like, which I've always tried to call out in the church. People often will refer to anybody who's not a Christian as a non-Christian. And I always challenge that when I hear it and say, well, hang on a minute, that doesn't feel to me like a good phrase to use. I said, I wouldn't want to be described as a non-Muslim, or a non-Jew. Let's honor people by if they are a member of another faith community, let's call them by that, not call them by what they're not.
Yeah.
But actually, I mean, that, and that in a way, that's the mildest form of it's hardly abusive to call somebody a non-Christian. But actually, you have started to other them and not to honor who they are. And as soon as you get to know somebody, you just don't think about doing it. You just, as soon as there's a relationship there, the relationship is, first of all, with our common humanity, then our common humanity amplified by our common belief in God, and then, yes, distinguished by the different faith traditions that we hold, but we hold them as sisters and brothers, friends. So I think that is the place to begin. I just suppose I don't feel as if I've ever got a lot further than that beginning.
Actually, back to Raggy.
Thank you very much, Iftikhar. Stephen, one of the things we're living through a sort of unique time in sort of modern history, dealing with sort of COVID, and it's obviously brought to all of our attention that we face, whether whatever faith we have or no faith, we face a common threat to all of us, our loved ones, our parents, our grandparents, everyone, that this disease is sort of, marked out just our common humanity. What role do you think the church or sort of faith has in trying to sort of get us out of this? Because obviously one of the main things has been vaccine skepticism that really does affect a lot, certain faith, communities. And so I just want to sort of ask, about sort of faith and COVID, really.
Yeah, well, three things immediately spring to mind. First of all, in terms of actually practical, good neighbourly support and help in communities, it has been people of faith who have led on that in most cases, with others, but often it's Christians and Muslims and Sikhs and Hindus and Jews who are in the forefront of actually helping with food shelters and homelessness shelters and debt relief and collecting prescriptions. And I think, the Church of England has had a very central place in that with others, simply because we do have a presence in literally every community. It's in some ways, despite our decline and our lack of influence, there are still 16, 17,000 branches of the Church of England across the nation. So we're able to do things. Yeah. So that's the first and most obvious thing that the church has done. Secondly, I think COVID has brought us face to face with our frailty and our mortality in ways in which our culture is usually quite good at concealing. Not as good as it likes to think. I often quote a conversation overheard on the tube a few years ago, two women speaking to each other, and one woman turned to the other. I'm just sort of hanging there on the tube. I can't help but listen to their conversation. One woman says to the other woman, how often do you think about death? These weren't particularly old women. How often do you think about death? The other one replied, oh, not very often, just once every few hours. And I thought, that's a really revealing comment that actually, although the culture likes to
put it away,
as if, right amount of exercise, high fiber diet, you'll live forever. Death is this tragedy, this mistake, but actually we do all know that we're mortal. COVID has brought that to the surface much more. And therefore, I have to be careful how I say this. I'm not suggesting for a moment, the danger is that people of faith say, oh, isn't it good? A crisis, people will be aware of their mortality, therefore they will think about God. But the reality is people are thinking about God. They are thinking about their mortality. They are asking those questions more obviously. And we, people of faith, must respond to that. And in the church, we've experienced some astonishing growth over the past year in very unexpected ways through growth in people participating online with the online communities that we've set up. Now, what will happen post-pandemic, we just don't know. But it's hard to find a church which doesn't say, well, we used to have 40 or 50 people worshipping in our church, in our village on a Sunday morning. We've now got 80 or 90 people participating online. So somehow, so that's one for us to reflect on. I've got no idea whether there's been an online Islamic presence. I don't know, be interested to hear. But the third thing is what I would call, really where we were talking earlier in relation to the public square, it's the narratives of hope. That I know it's become a bit hackneyed to say it, we don't want to go back to normal, we want to build back better. I think awareness of our mortality has also been an awareness of our humanity and our common humanity. We all know that until everyone's vaccinated, there's a sense in which no one is vaccinated. It has to be for everybody. Who would have thought that a year ago we would have considered somebody who stacks the shelves in the supermarkets a key and essential worker?
Exactly.
So there's been, as it were, a recalibrating of what we think of as the common good, common humanity. And I think those narratives are shaped by faith. They are about seeing the world from God's perspective, and therefore there's a real responsibility on us to build on all of that for the common good.
And Iftikhar, I mean, another sort of huge issue alongside sort of COVID that we all sort of face, which is the climate crisis. I think you want to ask Stephen about that.
Yeah, it's an area that, again, Muslims of Britain are very kind of concerned and involved in. I mean, obviously, all major faiths see stewardship of our natural environment as a kind of key principle. And do you think that there's an opportunity to bring faiths together to address climate change, or perhaps you've already been involved in sort of similar initiatives? But again, there is that commonality between faiths, in caring for the environment.
I mean, yeah, I mean, the short answer is absolutely. I think the Christian narrative is more problematic because I think it's been certain elements of Christianity that actually have led to or legitimized some of the oppression of the planet or the exploitation of the planet, which we need to repent of. So certain ideas of dominion over the land have probably not been helpful in the past. I think on the whole, we have repented of all of that. And we're now looking to other much deeper parts of our tradition about being good stewards of the land. And we share those ideas with people from other faith traditions. It is the most urgent question facing the world. How can we inhabit the world in a way that is mindful, sustainable, healthy, life-giving for everyone? It is the question facing the human race. Our faith gives us an understanding of our place within the created order. We understand that this world does not belong to us; it belongs to God. That we have responsibility as stewards, and I think it is incumbent upon us to, as we were saying earlier, faith can and should work together for the common good, and this issue is the supreme issue where we need to find a common voice.
But is this again, a space that maybe the Church of England, can lead on in terms of bringing the different faith groups together to work together for?
Yeah, I think it probably can. I mean, again, I think sometimes within the Church of England, we there's a slight I feel within myself sometimes a slight hesitancy because we are, as it were, the historic faith of this land. We have a agency, a convening capacity which other faiths don't tend to have. And therefore, we have a great responsibility to draw people together. On the other hand, I think we're mindful of some difficult bits of our history and don't want to appear to be kind of arrogantly and pompously saying, we'll lead, you follow. We don't want to do that. So I think we've got to strike that right balance of saying we have a responsibility and opportunity that maybe nobody else has, but we must do this together. It must be a joint and equal enterprise.
Thank you.
Great. I think we've come to the end of our.
Yeah, we probably
time.
need to stop. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you very much indeed, Stephen. Very, very interesting, and you touched on a lot of sort of revealing sort of issues and spoke very fluently. And thank you very much indeed. So I'll hand over to Iftikhar to
well, just to say, it's been I've really enjoyed chatting with you. I was told by Richard Sudworth, who I think you might have been in touch with.
Yes.
Because obviously I get interviewed lots of times, and Richard said, he says you're going to enjoy this one. It's friendly. It's a conversation, and I doubt that. But that's certainly been the case.
Thank you very much indeed.
Enjoyable.
That's good to know. So thank you so much for your generosity, for giving us time and actually being, extremely candid and open with us as well. And this will be going out hopefully to a wide audience, and I'm sure they're going to learn a lot about yourself as an individual, but also the church and the role that it's playing and continuing to play such an important role in this country. And from my perspective, long may it continue. So thank you for giving us your time.
Yeah, same here. And I think on that final question you raised, Iftikhar, about how we might work together in terms of a united voice on the climate emergency. If you have any thoughts,
Yes, I'd love to follow up with you on that.
Please, let's keep the conversation going. I mean, there are other bishops who lead on the climate agenda in the Church of England, but if you have some thoughts, don't hesitate to get in touch.
Thank you. I will do.
Very nice to meet.
Goodbye for now.
Cheers. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.